I'm gonna start the recording. Uh, Today we'll talk about some advanced topics that we didn't get the chance to talk about in detail throughout the class. Um, it'll be really high level. I think they're just fun topics to talk about, like holograms and haptics and olfactory displays and smell. So it'll be very high level, but I think the topics are cool, and I left plenty of resources so you could do some exploratory stuff on your own. But anyway, to finish up, to conclude what we talked about over the last few AR lectures, in terms of the industry, the rule of thumb nowadays is that Unity is by far the best for AR and Unreal is better for VR. When you get into indie and mobile territory, you kind of have the option of either one. When you're working with multi-platform stuff, Unreal 4 tends to be better. You probably realize this by switching platform in Unity and how long it takes. But Unity's low requirements do shine with these AR devices, which are barely stronger than like Galaxy S4s. Its integrations are much, much better because Unity Technologies, the company, had some really strong partnerships with Microsoft, for example, and so they just have much better samples. And Epic Games never really cared that much about AR until relatively recently, where they did actually start putting effort into trying to integrate things well. There are still some limitations in Unity's API that make it a little bit hard to make anything advanced, but I don't know, at this point it's more of a race to see like how long does it take for Unity to fix its bugs before like another engine can do it better. It'll be interesting to see over the next few years. So for example, networking is a huge limitation because networking is a really um, it's a really cool, lucrative application of AR in multi-user environments, like with spatial anchors and stuff. But it's so hard to get working with Unity's networking API. So that's kind of annoying. And animation, there isn't that much good animation in AR anyway, partially because of graphics limitations. But as we move into like 3D virtual assistants, like that Gamma study that I shared with you, that hopefully you'll do because it doesn't take very long and we can use users. But when we move on to virtual assistants, animation will start becoming important. So hopefully Unity makes its animation system a little bit more intuitive. Um, a few weeks ago, Microsoft released this library of animation of animated people that actually look like people called Rocketbox. So that kind of helps a little bit with trying to get many meshes working in Unity or many animated characters working in Unity with the same skeleton. So yeah, it'll be interesting. Like I said, it's a race to see like who can do, how long will it take for Unity to fix its bugs before another engine takes over, and will that even happen? It's just interesting from a bystander point of view. The local to global space errors, like such as in lossy scale, that some of you noticed doing some of the assignments, and some of the rounding errors make it a little bit. They make Unity a little bit limited in terms of scientific applications. Like for my own purposes, I try to keep scale at 111 as much as physically possible. Otherwise, it will, just breaks things. So, for example, we work with small real objects, like with surgical training, it's hard to do in Unity. And when we talk about markers and things like that, local space becomes more and more important. But just to move on, as an example, some of my work involves merging multiple tracking spaces that are tracked by different things, like the Vive and the HoloLens spaces. This is really annoying to do in Unity, but I don't have much of a choice because Unity is the only one that works with the HoloLens 1 and Vuforia. Um, but I'll admit that these are more problems. These are more of research problems than typical AR development problems. So I don't know. I mean, you have more options. I think it's not as it's not as dichotomous. I think with AR as it is with VR, where there are certain things that each engine is clearly better at. With AR, I think Unity is definitely the better option, at least as it stands. So anyway, moving on to these advanced topics, I just wanted to introduce some other cool AR VR displays, which are fun to look at. There was this type of display that was actually developed at UNC that I forgot to mention when we were talking about AR displays. It was called Pinlight displays, and uh, it's from this paper Maimone 2014, which I cited here, and you can check it out. It's actually a really good paper. So the way that the Pinlight displays work is they actually put the first combiner very, very close to your eyes, and so the image will already be defocused on that first combiner, and then they have another plane that, or they have this plane that tries to converge them onto an actual image. It was a kind of cool idea, and the results of what they were trying to do, it resulted in really wide field of view AR displays. So they actually had 110 degrees, which is way bigger than any of the other AR displays that we've seen. And you can check out the video which explains it. I want to just show you the prototype. Here they're actually embedding the pin lights. I want to show you like what the result looks like. So they had this teapot and you can move it around and stuff like that. And you know, it does display, it's stereoscopic, and again, it's 110 degrees field of view. So if you were to render the same viewpoint in the HoloLens, you would only be able to see a very small portion of this. And I don't know, it's just a cool idea. There are some limitations that I'll mention in a second. In particular, you'll notice that the colors seem a little bit off, but that's kind of a problem with most holographic displays. The way that this defocusing work is almost the exact opposite of how we saw light field rendering work, where you try to focus on subsection of the image and defocus the parts that don't matter. This is almost doing the opposite, which is kind of interesting. Huge field of view. The color is a little bit hard to get right, but that's true for almost all of these AR displays. And a huge limitation that they note in the paper that they also provide some solutions to, it involves making sharp edges. So you'll notice that these edges are very grainy, and that gives the appearance that the lens is very low resolution when it isn't necessarily. So that was a problem, and it kind of limits what you can display. But anyway, cool idea. I wanted to show you this because it was developed at UNC. And Maimone made another paper in 2017 which proposes a bunch of different types of near-eye displays, and is also another good read. So autostereoscopy is a fundamental concept of the displays that I'll talk about for the rest of, well, for most of the rest of this time. Autostereoscopy is the ability to see some 3D object without needing any kind of headgear. So most people have used a 3DS before, and you know that there is a sort of 3D, like from a certain angle you can see things in 3D if you turn the 3D slider up. There used to be 3D TVs and things like that. Anyway, this whole area of trying to produce holograms is called holography, and one way or another they are holograms, although in most cases they're just illusions. There are a couple ways of doing it that we'll see. 3D glasses are not actually autostereoscopic displays, but the way that they work is actually fundamentally the same as how the autostereoscopic displays work. We'll see parallax barrier displays or lenticular lenses, which describe the 3D TVs that used to be a thing. And these create some hologram with just visual trickery, basically, and multiplexing and things like that. The 3DS is another example of this. Some methods do it with reflections. Again, we'll see light fields. So they generate light fields for various viewpoints, and they render it to be perspective correct. And these reflective displays tend to be the ones that look the best from what I've seen and experienced. And there are other sort of reflective displays that intersect a bunch of images, and this is actually a really old method that we'll see. But anyway, so 3D glasses and the 3DS and most 3D TVs fall under this category of parallax barrier displays. And what they do is the image is multiplexed, so it basically alternates left and right image, and basically there are these barriers which stop one eye from seeing what another eye is supposed to be seeing from that perspective. And they're the cheapest and simplest type of autostereoscopic display. You know, you can sort of just create this anywhere, anyhow. They're very simple. They, like I said, they just multiplex the image. Multiplexing is when you merge a couple of channels into one, and the barrier just blocks a part of the part of the image that you shouldn't be able to see. So the right eye should only be able to see the orange portions here. The blue eye should only be able to see the blue portions. 3D glasses do something very similar, except they split the channels instead of trying to create a barrier. So one eye will render, so what the left eye will see is rendered in one color, and what the right eye sees is rendered in another color, and they're just overlaid on top of each other. So it's a kind of similar idea. These are called anaglyphs, but the colors end up looking bad, as you can imagine, because you're splitting channels. A problem with parallax barrier displays in general is that they make a lot of assumptions about where the user is located, and what their IPD is. This is the distance between your eyes. So there are only a couple of perspectives where it actually looks right in 3D, as you probably have noticed with 3DS if you've ever used that. It also effectively cuts resolution in half because it's, it's multiplexing it. So resolution in this case, it's hard to define, but it is basically just removing every other slice of the image, although it's not exactly how it's working, but to get the barrier to display correctly, you do effectively need to reduce resolution by a lot. And yeah, this describes the 3DS and most of the 3D TVs that you've probably seen before. There was this kind of cool 3D version of a parallax barrier display that I've seen before. The resolution is absolutely awful, and the result is not great, but it's a really cool idea to have a 3D parallax barrier display, and they have these concentric circles, which I guess are supposed to make the 3D effect overall better. I guess I couldn't find a paper that actually describes this. I think it was just a demo at a conference, but still, it was cool. A similar idea are called lenticular lens displays, and what these do is, instead of adding the barrier that stops your eyes from being able to see certain parts of the image, what lenticular lens displays do instead is cause your eye to converge on one of the images, or the right image from a certain perspective. So in this case, the right eye is trying to look at the image, and each slice of their field of view converges onto the image that they would see, and it converges into like one synthetic image from each eye perspective. And this is a cool idea because unlike parallax barrier displays, this can handle a wider range of viewer positions, because your head can move back and forth, left and right, and it will still look reasonably good because it's designed so that your eyes, their field of views already converge onto the right image. The resolution is still effectively cut because of this multiplexing, but it's definitely not as bad as with parallax barrier displays. There's this cool paper that you can read if you're interested in how they work and how they actually render the images for these types of displays. And there's this other paper from 2014 that has this result, actually. They use slanted lenticular displays instead of these vertical ones, because they had some mathematical reasons for doing so that I don't exactly remember or understand. I don't remember the result looking particularly better, but it was still cool. Here is an example of the vertical ones from this 2004 paper. Anyway, moving on. We've seen a couple of examples of these volumetric displays, but light field displays and volumetric displays tend to overlap quite a bit. These render a bunch of viewpoints from different perspectives, and they basically reflect the perspective correct image back to the viewer based on where they are. So there are a couple of examples of this. In this example, what they did was they actually have, let me show the image. They made this type of display where there's a projector that is projecting onto a mirror that's spinning very fast, and the mirror, it's designed such that the mirror reflects the part of the image that the person from that perspective, when the mirror spins in their direction, would be able to see. And the result was pretty good, actually. This is an older paper, so they don't have the best results, but I mean their video is not great, but you can see that there's this little spinning mirror, and trying to find the video demo. I don't remember what I was trying to show last time. Oh, I guess this head part looks pretty good. So you could sort of see the shadow of the, well, not a shadow, but the blurred mirror that's spinning. But even so, you can still see the hologram. So I think that's what makes this pretty cool, that despite having an occluder, it still seems as if it's rendering correctly. Anyway, that's a cool implementation of a volumetric display, or this is more of just a light field display. Another example is called Holovisio, which was a company that sort of specialized in this. And let me speed this up. They had this 3D TV that you can check out the paper for more details, but there is this kind of mirror apparatus behind the TV that it has jagged edges and it reflects the image back to the user based on their perspective. It's kind of complicated how it works, but the result was fairly good. And you'll notice the camera is moving side by side and the image still looks 3D. That's what it means for it to be, well, the range of perspectives is much higher than with parallax barrier displays. I think lenticular lenses can achieve a similar range of motion, but I'm not sure. I mean, these papers are sort of scattered, and you can check out the video for more details. This one is, it's sort of hard to tell the results when the TV itself is taking up the entire field of view. But anyway, one more Holovisio demo that I think is pretty good. They're showing these cards, and the part that you would be able to see from your perspective is reflected back to you using these jagged mirror type apparatus. And you can see the result is fairly good. I think the results are best when there's a lot of depth to be seen from different angles. So when the object in focus is not that far from you. Like this definitely looks pretty good, I would say. So free to check this out. I actually have, there's one that came out a few months ago that also looks really good. Anyway, these are a little bit limited for consumers because they're expensive and they require a lot of hardware at the moment. These TVs are generally really thick. Holovisio is this paper if you want to check it out. You still need to be in front of the screen, which makes it a little bit more limited than this one, for example. And Jones 2007 is this one if you want to check that one out. Here's a more modern example that came out recently, and they actually have an 8K image that can be seen on the screen. So, oh my god, I don't want to see this guy. They have this extremely high resolution display, and you know, the image looks right from every perspective, and it handles things like reflections really well. And this I thought was a really cool result where you can actually see the effect of his eye magnifying because of the way that it was recorded. And the way that they get this to work is, again, by recording a light field. They have an array of cameras that is generating images from different perspectives, and it somehow interpolates and reflects those back to the user based on which perspective is correct. So these are really cool displays in general. Again, they're still not super practical for consumers, but it's a cool idea, and you know, if these ever do become reasonably cheap, I mean, I think it would be cool to have a 3D monitor. Anyway, I think this is the last type of autostereoscopic display that I wanted to show you. It's a really old one. It was proposed in 1978, and the idea is fairly simple actually. What it's doing is there are multiple images that are reflected into an angled piece of glass or a mirror of sorts. Well, not a mirror or a piece of glass. It's translucent, not transparent. But anyway, these images converge onto a 3D position so that it looks 3D. And these are cool because you can build them, like pretty much anybody can build them, and you can find really cheap phone demos, and there are apps that get these images to be generated. This is an example from this company, Zarowski, where they have this cheap little projector, or they have a monitor that it displays images like this. It displays basically 4 copies of the image from different perspectives that can converge onto this pyramidal shape. This is actually similar to an idea that we use in 3D audio, where it's this idea in 3D audio that with real speakers you can generate good virtual audio by synthesizing a wave field where you get multiple audio waves to converge onto one point where the listener is. So This is an old idea, but it's cool, and it's cheap, and it's easy to make or buy, and I guess you can impress people with it if you really wanted to. I wanted to bring up caves at some point because these were really, really popular in VR for a long time, and you can still find implementations of them at different universities. Caves are these older VR displays that used projectors and some amount of head tracking to render images onto the screens, and it rendered the image that the user would be able to see from that perspective. So it actually still did have the effect of you being in a virtual environment. They're basically translucent walls, and a projector projects an image, and the person is wearing these glasses that they're being tracked somehow, and they're wearing these glasses that let them see certain parts of the image that would be appropriate for each eye. I'll show you an example in a second. They're called caves because they're based on, at least from what I was able to read, they're based on the cave allegory from Plato's Republic, if you've ever seen that, or if you've ever read that. The cave allegory is that basically everything we see in reality is some reflection of the true nature of that shape, which is sort of true just in terms of light mechanics. Like when you see an object, you're seeing a reflection of light onto the shape of the object. So I guess that was what they were going for. Caves were popular because compared to older VR devices, they were arguably cheaper and more ergonomic and easier to get working, because older HMDs had tons of wires. The tracking systems were pretty expensive. They were pretty heavy. There was a limitation in GPUs. There were a lot of reasons that older HMDs were a little bit hard to get. They took a while to take form into what we see today. They were, like I said, they were very low latency. It was hard to generate the images fast enough for each eye because GPUs were not fast enough. And caves have the unique benefit of being that each screen can be rendered individually. You can sort of render each screen from a different PC and network them together and multiplex the images as needed. So you can distribute the workload a little bit better. Old HMDs, very heavy, a lot of wires. The limitation of caves is that they require a lot of hardware and space, and as you can imagine, it doesn't take long before you just hit a wall. So there is some work going on now, such as at the HIT lab in New Zealand, where they use techniques like walking in place and redirected walking to make it possible to walk around a cave indefinitely without hitting anything. It's a little one limitation also with networking in general is that it's a little bit hard to synchronize the images. But this paper, Blue Sea, which I have a slide for right here, it describes the rough process that they go through to get this to work. Blue Sea is cool because it basically built the foundation for how cave systems work, how they network their images together, how they merge all the results, and so on. What they do is they multiplex the image for each screen, and we already saw multiplexing with parallel barrier displays, where you have parallel images that are crisscrossed together. For caves, they multiplex them horizontally, so that basically these horizontal barriers are blocking the appropriate part of the image instead. You can check out the paper for more details. Also, because the projectors had such extremely bright lights, and there were also other light sources that were trying to uniformly light the person themselves for tracking, these glasses were useful for kind of protecting their eyes. Some examples of caves that we've already seen before. The Human Tails paper used a cave. And this paper is from 2013, before headsets can really track. Back then, I think the Oculus... I don't even know if the Oculus DK1 was out at this point. The Oculus DK1 was basically the first version of the Oculus. I don't know if it was out in 2013. At least I don't know if it was publicly accessible. But anyway, back then it was really hard to do the tracking and reconstruction of this person. In their case, they're just tracking their bodies because they don't need to reconstruct the person because they're just projecting the skeleton onto some other entirely different character. But nowadays, as is hopefully intuitive from the IK material, nowadays we can do the tracking well enough inside of a VR headset, so we don't really need a cave to do this. But reconstruction is still very, very hard on a VR headset. But I just brought this up because they did use a cave. Also, we've seen this telepresence demo before from 1998, and this isn't exactly a cave, but the idea is still sort of similar, where you would look at some opaque or maybe mirror type wall, and instead of seeing the wall itself, what you're hopefully looking into is a virtual environment, or in their case, they're trying to project some other real environment such that it's like you're looking through a window. So the idea is still pretty similar to a cave. Anyway, moving on to haptics, and we won't get into much detail because we don't have time, and I just wanted to show you a bunch of cool applications of haptics and define some terms so that if you are interested, you can check out the material yourself. But haptics involves a sense of touch and the sense of kinesthesia, which locomotion also sort of tries to handle. It's that sense of being able to know where your body is and what it's doing, even if you can't see it. So there are multiple types of haptic devices, or haptic sensations. Cutaneous haptics are haptics that are related to skin sensations, so being able to feel the texture of an object, for example, with your skin sensing abilities. I don't remember much from physiology, as you can tell. Anyway, kinesthetic haptics is it's being able to feel the motion of some limb. So your own human kinesthetic ability allows you to feel the motion of your arm even if you can't see it. You just know where it is because you can feel it. With kinesthetic haptics, it's sort of the same, except you're feeling the motion of another limb, which is normally meant to actually represent, it normally represents some other limb in the game that is like an extension of yourself, but in any case, it's besides the point. Then you have another axis of active and passive haptics. Active haptics is when the user themselves move. The users God, English is hard. The users move by themselves and the device doesn't move, or the device doesn't. Okay, the stimulus is the user moving the device, not the device moving the user. That's the main difference. So with cutaneous, well, actually, I have these in a second, like what an example of each of these is. So let me move on. A passive haptics is the opposite, where the device itself is moving the user, not the other way around. So with active haptics, the user, for example, can press onto these little blocks, and the blocks will respond by they'll respond to the force of the user. With passive haptics, the blocks will just move into place, and the user will feel them moving. In VR, it's a little bit different. There's a little bit ambiguity with this term. In VR, passive haptics usually refers to an object being physically present, and when virtual and physical objects are aligned, and we'll see some examples that we've already seen before, actually, like Mihen. When the physical and virtual objects are aligned, the physical object is called a haptic proxy. Another example of passive haptics is when controllers vibrate. Your hand is holding a controller, and your hand is pretty rigid, but the controller provides vibrations that your hand responds to, like you feel the sensation. Even if you're not doing anything, you're always kind of holding the controller the same way. Some examples of each of these intersections. Active cutaneous haptics would be the example of a static haptic proxy. So if you had a physical table aligned with some virtual table, and you were in a VR headset and you put your hand to where the virtual table is, you would feel a physical table. And this is active because you are moving your hand, the table is not doing anything. For example, the Mihan 2002 study that we've seen before does this. And it was the PIT demo, which I actually have a slide for in a few slides. An example of passive cutaneous haptics would be the MIT demo from their media lab, where actually this might not have been the demo that I was thinking of. guess it is. So, no, this isn't exactly the demo that I was thinking of. You might have seen a demo before. Well, I guess this is a good example. So, the passive part is the device moved the pins in place such that they could feel this function, and the user felt the function, but they didn't actually provide any feedback to the device. They were just trying to feel what the device created as a haptic sensation. You might have seen that example also from MIT Media Lab with a similar device where there was a wall generating faces, and people could feel the faces on the walls. That would be another example of passive cutaneous haptics. An example of active kinesthetic haptics is covered over the next few slides, but most haptic arms are in this category, where you, the user, are moving the arm around and it is responding with some force to try to restrict your motion. Passive kinesthetic haptics seems to be pretty rare and a little bit vague as to what it describes, but the general idea is that, or the best example that I could think of based on doing research on this and trying to figure it out with very vague definitions, is that an example would be like when a haptic arm is guiding you. So if your hand is not moving at all, but the haptic arm is moving itself in position, for example, to try to guide you along a path, then that would be a passive kinesthetic haptics. From what I've seen, it's almost always mixed with active haptics somehow. So, for example, the user moves this device, or they try to move the device. That would be the active part, but then the device responds with some force. That would be the passive part, I suppose. But it's sort of like the XR spectrum, where maybe it's not so set in stone. Moving on, I mentioned in this previous slide impedance devices and admittance devices. Impedance devices are these devices where, let me full screen again. Impedance devices are these devices where the device responds to the user with forces that try to limit their motion. So these haptic arms are an example where the user is moving the arm around and it's freely moving until they reach a virtual surface, in which case it impedes itself and tries to stop itself from moving. But apart from that, it doesn't require anything special to get it to move. The part that requires effort is getting it to not move. So that's what an impedance device is. This is a cool example, and I actually got one of these devices working in the lab right before quarantine started because I wanted to show it during the Science Expo. But this is a cool example from a few years ago where you can draw in VR with one of these haptic devices, and you can feel exactly where this face is, and the device stops you at the surface of the face so that you can draw accurately onto it. They're pretty cool, and they feel weird. Like I said, they impede the movement. This is the most common type of haptic arm that you'll see, and another way to think about it is that, like I said, getting the device to move is actually pretty easy, but what's not as easy is getting it to stop. So the device tries to restrict its own movement as opposed to allow itself to move. Here, actually, let me show this video first because it's the same device. There was this haptic plugin in Unity that is actually what I got to work in the lab before quarantine. This is just another example of this Phantom Omni device. And you can feel the virtual board, and you can play Jenga. And if any of you are here when the quarantine ends and you get to try this out in the VR lab, what's kind of cool is that you can actually feel the weight of the blocks. Like the arm actually pulls down to try to simulate how heavy the blocks are. And things that are lighter, like a feather, basically won't pull down at all. But if you have a heavy metal block, it'll pull down really hard. And a problem with impedance devices in general is that if the force that is trying to stop the arm is too strong, you can actually risk breaking it. And you'll actually hear it grinding. It's kind of scary. Here's another example of a different type of impedance device. In the locomotion chapter, we actually saw robots sort of like this, which try to move themselves in a position such that the user walks on them. So I think that the example that we saw last time was with stairs. So the robots were trying to move themselves into positions such that the user felt like they were walking on stairs. These devices are trying to position themselves in such a way that they represent, or in such a way that the entire shape that they create is the haptic proxy that represents the virtual object that they're trying to touch. So notice that the robots configure themselves so that they're shaped like this stealth bomber thing. See? So this was a pretty cool demo. And the paper itself, I remember, being pretty good too. Admittance devices, on the other hand, they're basically the exact opposite. Moving the device is the hard part, and getting to stop is not the hard part. So with admittance devices, the device will move as a result of the user forcing it to move, but it's not just freely moving already. It'll be better explained through videos. But the user's forces are admitted to the device. The device doesn't move otherwise. And it's the opposite of impedance devices. So getting it moving is the hard part. You actually need motors to get these devices to work. And an example of this we'll see is with these robots where there is a motor or a servo that will force it to move in response to what the user is doing. So here's an example where the user they're moving this apparatus. And in this case, it might be a little bit of a merge of impedance and admittance. So the impedance part could be that these virtual arms are stopping the user from being able to move more than the robot is physically capable of. The admittance part is translating the user's motion into the servos moving. Because if you're not doing that, then the robot just doesn't move. This is a cool video that you can check out where you actually feel like you are the robot. I tried one of these demos before, and it is very weird seeing yourself as a robot. These demos are often presented, well, in this case they're presented with a VR headset, but you can also present them as a mirror, basically, where you show the mirror that the robot is seeing so that it looks like you yourself are what is causing those motion. And this is sort of analogous to why one-to-one, or why mirrors are useful in VR for getting a person to think that they are another avatar, because mirrors allow you to see the one-for-one motions. Let's see, this one is, well, here's another example of another person controlling a robot. You can see that they have this device and it's being tracked somehow. It's probably not tracked externally. Servos are pretty good at tracking themselves, and you can use IMUs and things like that. And again, this is another example where there might be some impedance, where the device that the user is holding would stop itself from moving more than these hands can move. So we talked about biomechanical constraints before. Here is another example. And this is another demo that I've tried before, and it's definitely a very strange type of haptic sensation, where these wires are what control the position of the device that you would interact with, and the wires don't move until they translate the user's force into a motor movement. So it's just another example of where getting the device to move is actually the hard part, not getting it to stop. To get it to stop, you just stop the motors from making any changes. Actually, well, where is phase 5? So in this, as an example, there is some virtual wall here, and the device stops the person from being able to move the device past the wall. So that's what these devices are meant to do. And finally, there was this more surgical type application. Well, actually, no, this wasn't the surgery application. I don't remember where that is. This was, let me move forward. The example that they were showing here is, this paper was about trying to calibrate one of these devices. So with these devices, there is some sensor that tries to detect how much force the user is trying to apply, and then it applies that force to the motor to get this thing to move in that direction. So in this paper, they were trying to figure out how much force is actually how much feels comfortable. They were trying to, the idea was that they would try to get the user to calibrate the display by getting them to follow this track. So the user tries to apply some force, and the force gets applied to the motor. In this part of the video, they were actually showing how it can be way too strong. It can be so strong that it's impossible to move the motors. Like if you weaken the signal too much, or if you damp the user's force too much. Anyway, just a couple of examples. You're free to check out some of the papers that I cited for more examples, like this 2019 paper in particular is really good at explaining the difference. We've seen this example of haptics in VR before, and I'm also going to show you some, well, not show you, but refer you to some papers that you can read if you want more information. This was a UNC paper, actually, I think, that describes why passive haptics is really useful for virtual environments. We've seen this particular demo, the PIT demo from Meehan 2002, a few times now, and in their simulation, the user is walking around the user can freely walk through the training room and the pit room, and it is designed such that the physical piece of wood here is a haptic proxy representing a piece of wood in the pit room, so that when you dangle your toes over the edge of the wooden board, it feels like you're dangling your toes over the edge of the virtual board. And in this picture, he's using shoes, but what they found was that it's more effective when you use socks, because then you can kind of feel your toes dangling over. And the haptic sensation in general, just feeling the piece of wood, is more realistic when you're not wearing shoes. And this is the paper that I just referred you to from 2019, which I think does a good job of explaining the differences between active and passive haptics. There's this other paper from some people at UNC as well that came out a few years ago on haptic rendering in general. It's a really good book. I think I have a copy of it in the lab, actually, if you want to borrow it. Some videos of haptic sensations in VR. There is one that you might have actually seen. The poster is in front of the VR lab. It's on redirected touching. And that paper in particular didn't have a video, but there is one that's very similar, where what they do is they distort the haptic sensation so that the person feels like they're actually moving their finger along this curved box as opposed to just a regular box. And it's a really cool idea. Here you can see active markers. We haven't really seen active markers in action before. So this is redirected touching. In Coley's paper from 2010, he used the leap motion instead of this. And what he did was have the person trace a curved virtual surface that where its haptic proxy is actually a flat surface. But the idea is basically the same. So this is a paper from UNC. There is a sort of similar paper that I like to call redirected grabbing that came out in 2016. That's also pretty cool. What they did was they actually distorted the sensation so that the person could be convinced that a single block is actually all three blocks by just redirecting where their physical trajectory is. Or they redirect where the hand is inside of the virtual scene. It's a really cool idea. And there are some other cool examples that you can check out. Like there is this example where they were using one of these, they were using this apparatus to restrict the virtual or the VR user's motion. And they were tracking them, and this looks like an admittance device to me actually, but I don't know the paper well enough to say for sure. But they're using this device here, and these wires are restricting the motion, or the wires are restricting the motion of this device that the user is holding onto to give it the sensation that the cube is heavy or light. There's some therapeutic application where this robot tries to move itself such that it's a haptic proxy inside of the VR game. So I wonder if they have a video demo. So here they're using the example of a door opening and closing, and the robot, it impedes its own movement such that the door feels as heavy as it actually is. And this could be done in VR as well. There was this other cool paper where they were actually using ultrasound to create the sensation. So with ultrasound, you can create waves that feel a certain way and cause certain physical sensations. Let me show an example. So in this example, they have a head that's being rendered with ultrasound, and there is some signal that's creating waves in the appropriate place so that you can feel the wave pushing back. And finally, you've probably seen this, the haptic suit, where there are a bunch of vibratory motors inside, and it's not safe to impede a user with a suit like this because you can cause like actual physical trauma by stopping a user from moving completely. But the vibratory motors give a good enough sensation to feel like you're getting hit and things like that. So finally, our very last VR topic, and it's only a single slide because these are very rare, but olfactory displays create a sense of smell. And like I said, they're very rare, but they have some cool and interesting applications, especially when you factor in the fact that smell is considered one of the senses that has the strongest impact on memory. So you could do interesting things with presence and memory and spatial awareness and navigations and things like that. The way that they do this basically is by mixing a couple of sprays in the form of scented droplets. So here's a good framework that you can read from this paper where they have some material, like some liquid, and it's vaporized with heat, and each scent is vaporized into a different like cloud, basically. That's very high level, but it's basically like a different vapor cloud, and then there's some other device that blends them together so that you can create a certain scent. If you want to find some analogy, it's similar in concept of what blend shapes do, where you have a couple of different extremities, like in this case the odor itself, like each of these odors is sort of like an extremity, and then you can blend them together to create some intermediate pose, or in this case an intermediate odor. So I'm frozen? Am I still frozen? Okay, I'm good now. We're almost at the end anyway, and I'm recording this. Anyway, the way that they finally send out the scent to the user is with these little fans, and heat is used to actually atomize the liquid scent. So some quick demos from a couple of universities. In this case, what they did was they wanted to represent what it smells like to be washing something. So they mounted this thing to the headset, which is basically the odor plus some fans. And I actually don't know if this was a fan or if it was just done with pressure, like when you squeeze a baster. But anyway, it pushes out the scent as a vapor, and you smell it, and you're like, oh god, it's a fish. So that's an example. And there's this other example, which I believe this is exactly the one that I tried before, where they mount the vapor creator thing under the VR headset so that it blows directly into your nose. And I guess in this case you can smell nature and oranges and stuff. The demo that I tried involved trying to search for the source of a fire, and you can smell like which room smells more fiery. So anyway, that's our very last VR slide. Next time we will talk about how research in VR and AR works and kind of wrap up. So you're free to leave. Bye. Try not to get viruses.